Welcome to webinar Wednesdays of the National Community Action Partnership. I am Amy Gendusa English with the Energy Partnerships Project at NCAP, and I am very excited for the content that we're going to share today. A few items of housekeeping before we proceed. Today's webinar, we're calling it a webinar, but it is being hosted in Zoom meeting mode. We do that to encourage dialogue and interaction between the members of our network. We want everybody to get to know each other. And so participants are encouraged to come off camera if you're comfortable, and be sure to update your name, and please take the time to introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like. As I said, today's session is being recorded, and after the fact, I will circulate a link to the recording as well as a PDF of the slides to everybody who registered. So even if they are not present today, they will be able to access the content. We do have time built in for question and answer, but if a question occurs to you during the presentation, feel free to post a question in the chat. As your host, please feel free to email me after the fact if you post or pose a question that doesn't get answered verbally or in the chat. I'm more than happy to follow up and make sure that you do get the information that you're looking for. Next slide. Thank you. So hopefully most of you are aware that we have our annual convention coming up August 31st to September 2nd in New York City. Registration is still open, though the hotel block is full. So if you register at this time, you have to use an overflow hotel. And I will put convention information in the chat so you can link to find out more about it. I do want to let you know that today's presenters are also going to present similar content at the annual convention. So that's exciting. If you like today's content and you're going to be at the annual convention, I would encourage you to come on Wednesday, August 31st at 3:45 for the session called Apprenticeship Pathways for Weatherization Workforce Development. So some of the things that we're going to talk about today will be expanded upon in that session at the annual convention. Next slide. This is one of my favorite parts of all NCAP events. We're going to recite the promise of community action. Please feel free to come off mic and say it with me. Otherwise, you can follow along. Stay on mute. The promise of community action. Action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. Thank you. Next slide. Without further ado, I will turn the speaking part over to our capable presenters from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to talk about the results of the Weatherization Assistance Program continuous improvement process.
Hi, Amy. This is Allison Moe. I'm with NREL. Can everyone hear me? Okay, thumbs up. Great. Okay. So as Amy mentioned, I'm here today with my colleague Juliana Williams. She'll be speaking a little bit later. Juliana, you can wave if you want to. And we're going to talk about information that came out of the continuous improvement workshop that NREL hosted back in May of this year. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the continuous improvement workshops, the idea is that this is a space for Department of Energy to hear directly from weatherization agencies on the ground about what is working, what's not working, how DOE can help address issues. You can see here listed on the slide the continuous improvement workshops workshops evolved out of some other things that had been done in the past, but since 2019, NREL has been organizing and implementing these, and believe it or not, there are a lot of changes that have happened from DOE that came about as a direct result of feedback we got in these workshops. So just a few examples, and this is background. We're going to be getting into workforce specific items, but there was NREL worked with Department of Energy and others to create free comprehensive online training curriculum for subgrantees on administrative processes. And earlier this summer, a new series of modules was put out there for grantees as well. More recently, NREL worked with Department of Energy to develop regional priority lists for multifamily buildings, things like that. So every workshop is a little different, has different topics and focus areas, but these are ways that DOE can listen and hear directly from people. So we are going to move on to what we're doing today. Today, again, is from a workshop that we held in May earlier this year that was on workforce development, recruitment, and retention. We are going to hear myself and my coworker, Juliana, we're going to summarize sort of the key takeaways, share some innovative approaches that were shared with us from that workshop related to recruitment and retention. We'll share resources and then getting some feedback from all of you who are listening in on what things that you're doing. We'd love to hear about that, and also resources or information that could be helpful for you in addressing these items. So this workshop or this webinar is split into two sections. The first section here is about building a workforce pipeline. The second is going to be more on employee retention. I'm going to stop every few slides at sort of natural breaking points to ask clarifying questions if you have them on the actual content. And then we do have time again built in at the end to have more of a discussion about, again, what everyone's doing, ideas you have, concerns or questions, that sort of thing. So I'm going to start here. This is just background information. It's sort of a snapshot of things that are going on with workforce in the energy efficiency industry overall. This data is not WAP specific. That doesn't really exist at this time, but I think it's helpful to frame this discussion about workforce in terms of the challenges and understand that the challenges that most weatherization or many weatherization agencies are facing around this are not unique to WAP. So according to a comprehensive national survey that there's a link at the bottom, you can all access this if you want to. The national energy efficiency workforce is still recovering from the COVID-19 shock. It's still below 2019 levels. When they survey employers, difficulty hiring is the top reported difficulty. That's from 91% of construction energy efficiency employers and 80% of professional services employers. I include professional services because I think often the conversation in this space happens around field staff, but of course nothing gets done if you don't have everyone else backing it up in the office and on the other sides of this. So just understand that it is across the board. Another trend to come out of that survey is that women, Black or African American, and Hispanic or Latino workers continue to be underrepresented in the energy efficiency industry compared to workers overall. So again, just setting the stage, this is an official national report. Such a thing doesn't quite exist at this time for WAP, though we did recently wrap up a similar effort that will get talked about a little bit later, but it probably sounds, familiar. And so these are the challenges that we're facing. I'm going to get into opportunities here in just a second. But I just, again, to part of the framing, everyone here is probably about to see a big influx of money from the bill funding. Now that's an opportunity, but it creates its own challenges in terms of ramping up production, wrapping up staff to meet that production, which is part of why we're doing the workshop we did earlier. We're doing this webinar, and we have some resources we're going to talk about to help all of you prepare for that ramp up. So here, again, I'm just going to quickly go through some, we talked about the challenges. Here are some resources that are already either developed or in process. So hopefully at this point, everyone has heard about the wage survey that NREL and NASCASP did together in 2021. This, 286 agencies from 27 states responded to this. And the results are available on NASCASP's website and include data about wages and benefits by different HEP positions and by state. There's also an interactive tool that you can use to compare the wages that you provide to what are considered living wage thresholds by county. And then NREL also worked with NASCAS to develop a series of flyers. You can see one shown here that can be used in sort of recruitment efforts. Some of these are state specific and some of them are customizable so that you can go and download and just use them as you want. This survey I will mention is going to be updated next year. So we're hoping to do it every 2 years. I know everyone is very surveyed out at this moment. So hopefully in 6 or 8 months, when you see that coming through, you will take a few minutes and respond to that. It's really helpful data. NREL has also worked with DOE and IREC and other partners to develop, as I mentioned, free online trainings for administrative staff. And so there is a sub-grantee training that was available for the last number of years. A grantee training was just released last month. So be aware that those are out there. There's something called an installer badges toolkit, which again, NREL helped to develop, and it allows organizations, WAP and other ones doing similar work, to track either their trainees or their new hires, the specific skills that they're gaining. It's sort of a smaller scale than like a full certification. And then NREL is working on some other tools that are coming soon related to training and workforce development. There will be job aids that walk through each task for retrofit installers with sort of step-by-step instructions and photos, a 3D model of a house that will allow people to go through virtually and sort of see, again, tied to those job aids, exactly where things happen, what they look like, how to do them. As I mentioned, NREL did a workforce hiring needs survey that closed last month, and that analysis will be available in the fall, probably. We're also developing right now a workforce development toolkit, which is basically going to take the information from our May workshop and the information you're hearing today, and basically just compile all of the resources and information related to workforce development and put it in one organized, easy to access place so that you don't have to go to NASCAS's website and IREC's website and NREL's website and DOE's website and try to put it all into one place. So again, there are a lot of things happening. But also, I just think it's important to notice that everyone here, there are a lot of things happening on the ground. That's where the real change happens, where you're finding partners, where you're implementing solutions that are specific to your location. And the next series of slides that I'll go through highlights some examples of some of those things. I do also want to say, as we go through some of the information and some of the examples that we're offering them here for your benefit. Nothing that I tell you will probably help you hire the person that you need today or the person that you needed 3 weeks ago or 3 months ago or something like that. But the idea behind building a workforce pipeline, this section, is that you can maybe put something in place next week that can help you hire someone in 3 months or 6 months or a year and that sort of thing. So I want to frame that. I know that there are things in the chat that it's hard for me to see. Are there any questions that I should answer before I move on?
It doesn't look like yet. Yeah, I'll keep monitoring that for you, Allison.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So the first example of sort of a worker pipeline model that we're going to talk about is registered apprenticeship. And I think many people know at least generally what this is. And I know NCAP hosted a webinar earlier this year highlighting what one specific weatherization agency is doing in this arena. But I do want to talk about it. The image that you see right here is from Jobs for the Future, which is a nationwide nonprofit that supports registered apprenticeship in terms of like what it is. So apprenticeship is a highly structured and experiential approach to building employees' skills. So it combines on-the-job training with related instruction, and it's all under the supervision of skilled workers. So here's some information and just sort of statistics about why you might want to do this. And I just think these are interesting, right? So in terms of retention, this is for all registered apprenticeships. It's not specific to WAP or specific to construction, but over 80% of apprentices stay in the job where they received their training, and 91% of apprentices stay in the industry for which they receive that training. So in terms of retention, which we're going to talk about later, it can actually be not only a recruitment tool, but a retention tool as well. It's sort of cost effective. You can see some of that there. It provides highly skilled employees that are trained specifically to what you want them trained with. There's less turnover, and there's just positive experiences from employers who have engaged with the registered apprenticeship program. So Moving on, there are some examples in the Weatherization network. So most notably is NECAC in Missouri, and there's a webinar on this. I've linked to it and linked to various information if people want to find more. But basically, they last year spent 6 months or less putting together a registered apprenticeship program and also developed a pre-apprenticeship program. It's a 1-year, 2,000-hour program, and they work with their local workforce investment board, and they're working with a local vocational technical school to help recruit people. And so it's, again, a structured approach to providing not only the training, but the skills learning that people do when they first are hired on as staff. They did just graduate like a month ago or something. They just graduated their first 2 apprentices, and they have 9 more starting up for the next round, which I think is really exciting, meaning that it's working for them and it's working for their apprentices, and their partners are engaged. And then they have a pre-apprenticeship program, I think in coordination with a local high school, that is then a sort of another attachment onto that pipeline of people into their registered apprenticeship program. And then I do want to say that there are plenty of non-WAP specific examples. So in these next few slides and few sections, I'm going to give WAP examples and non-WAP examples, because there are a lot of organizations doing recruitment and some level of training in weatherization and related things, and they're not connected to the weatherization network. And so I think they're just opportunities, one, to learn from what they're doing, but also to just be aware that these are, places where partnerships could exist. So this is an example, Detroit working for environmental justice. It's a green jobs training program, and it does have an actual apprenticeship program attached to it. So, or a pre-apprenticeship program that is not specific to weatherization, but includes weatherization in it. So I'm giving these as just examples that there are people out there who are doing this, who have done it, who have had positive experiences with it. And I encourage you, when you get this slide deck, to go into those and learn a little bit more about them if it's something that interests you. We have a lot to get through in this time, so I'm not going to be able to give a ton of detail on each of these. Are there any questions on these before I move on?
Yeah, Allison, there's a comment here that some trade union partners don't like weatherization using the term apprentice because it seems to compete with their training programs, even if it's a DOL registered apprenticeship program. This is more, I think, an observation, but context that's important to note that we are in a situation where a lot of industries are competing for workers, as Allison kind of mentioned at the beginning. And so the more that we can have, the communication and dialogue with partners, so that they understand, where we're trying to go and how it aligns, the better it will be. But yeah, in some respects, we are in competition, and WAP is trying to stake out some footing relative to other partners. So that's just a dynamic we'll have to face.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, unions haven't traditionally been engaged quite a lot with weatherization and energy efficiency, but that is changing as that is getting more attention and more funding and things like that. And it's a real thing. And I think what Juliana is saying, right, that like WAP is competing with the construction industry and the manufacturing industry and all of these unions for like the same pie. And so some of the registered apprenticeship program, not quite so much, but these next 2 examples I'm going to talk about are about like growing that pie. So it's not like, can I just get a bigger slice of pie and take it away from someone else, which is where the unions have concern, which is legitimate. Everyone has some sort of feeling of that because you're all competing over that same pie. So the idea of like growing the pie, right, so that everyone can have a slightly larger, which is a cheesy analogy, but I think it works. So that's what this pipeline piece is about. So this slide, again, it's if you're interested in the apprenticeship program, there's a link here. You can go here and you click on the map and you can find out who to contact to start that process in your area. Okay, so then this next little session that I'm going to talk about is core programs. I feel like the picture is showing up. So core programs. So core programs engage workers in paid service over a specified term, which is often a year, though not always, and they're always addressing conservation and community needs. So often people have heard of AmeriCorps. There are different versions of this. There is VISTA, which are often in the office. There are people who are supporting capacity building for organizations. There's NCCC, which is like the old CC model, where young people sign up and they go and spend like 6 weeks on each project in different locations over the course of a year. There's a senior core program. Then there are programs like Youth Build and Job Corps, Service Year Alliance. There are a lot of different models that are sort of use the same basis and are funded and organized in different ways. But really, I will say that like the benefits for core members of engaging in this program, they get a living stipend, they get career and technical training, they get an education award, often though not always, which means they may not be getting paid a lot, but at the end of their term, they get money that can be used to pay off student loans, pursue higher education, that sort of thing. And then they can get sort of certifications often while they're in this core program. And so I'm going to give a couple, sorry, I'm having weird things with my screen. I'm going to give a couple of examples of how this is happening. So this is an example that just is finishing up their first pilot year, the Climate Impact Course. So this is in Minnesota, and basically it's an AmeriCorps specific program. Members are supporting installation and energy auditing and other services. It's very interesting. They worked with 2 WAP agencies, one in Twin Cities, so one a little bit more urban, one a little bit more rural. They're about to expand it to 4 additional agencies. But again, they have young people, actually all ages, I shouldn't say that. They had young people and people sort of nearing the end of their careers. And they came in and they're helping in all of these ways that you see. And so it was a success. And so they're expanding it next year, which I think is really interesting. And then here is a non-WAP example, I will say. So this is the E3 Smart Building Training Center in Long Island, New York, and they have a partnership with Youth Build, and Youth Build combines skills training with GED education. It's specifically for youth. And as far as I know, they are not working specifically with weatherization agencies, but they are teaching weatherization skills and trying to find them employment afterwards within related fields. And again, I think it's important. I actually know of many other core programs that are doing weatherization, but not with the WAP network. I had meetings last week with some of them, and they're very interested, right? They want to make sure that they are teaching people appropriate skills that make them marketable. They want to connect them to employers who are looking for workers. But I think one thing that is interesting about the core model versus other sort of pipeline models is not only are these people signing up to learn about construction skills or weatherization skills or energy related skills, they want to learn those skills, but they want to serve their community, right? That's at the heart of all of these core programs is some of those sort of softer skills that that you may not get from someone who just has the technical knowledge or technical abilities. These are people who, want to spend their lunchtime talking to a homeowner and spend that little bit of extra time. And I think that's just a very cool connection there. In terms of how, if you're interested in AmeriCorps programs, there are a lot of different ways you can do it. So here are some examples of like either creating your own program or finding a new program or an existing program in your state that maybe you can collaborate with. But I will say, similar to the registered apprenticeship program, something like this can often seem overwhelming, right? The idea of hiring like a purposefully temporary workforce for, a 1-year term of service can seem like just not what you want to do when you're looking for your permanent staff. But I will say they're temporary, but you plan that, right? You know as an employer that you're going to have people coming in at this time in the year, they're going to complete it this year. In those first few months, they're going to need additional support or assistance to get up to speed. They are going to be getting some level of training before they even come in. But then, by the end of the year, they're a part of your staff, and many of them may want to join your staff if you have positions available. I was a person who came through AmeriCorps with the Habitat for Humanity. I had this idea idea of like doing it for 1 year, which turned into 7 years on a construction staff. So I didn't know that I had the construction skills, but I wanted to learn about it. And I was able to gain those skills and become part of that staff for a long time. So I just will say it is, if it's something that you're interested in, I'd love to talk to you and hear about it and have those conversations about ways that maybe Department of Energy can facilitate that kind of a partnership there. Before I move on to my next section, are there any questions about AmeriCorps or core models?
We haven't had anything new come in through the chat, Allison.
Okay, perfect. Moving on. Okay.
Before you do move on, though, I do want to say this is something that is of like a high degree of interest across the network. And so if, I want to reiterate what Allison said. If there are folks here who are interested in pursuing these partnerships, like we want to know about that so that, with NREL and NCAP, NASCASP, DOE, we can also help facilitate those relationships along the way and those partnerships. So this is an active space where we are pursuing and trying to figure out the right role for the lab and for DOE in partnership with some of these organizations.
Yeah, and to build on that, I mentioned that most of you today will be seeing bumps in funding coming from the infrastructure law money, but DOE has money that they want to spend, to support sort of TNTA workforce development, and they want to know the best way to spend it, right, over the next course of the year. So that's part of this. Again, there are all these opportunities of things to do, and we want to make sure we're putting our efforts where it's going to most benefit the network. Okay, so this last, maybe it's not the last section, I have one more after this, but this next section is on CTE, which is Career and Technical Education. So for people who may not have heard this acronym, it used to be sort of what was like VOTEC or shop class in high schools, and those sort of like went away and then were Phoenix rebirthed and rebranded and all of these things. And CTE addresses a whole lot of things that are not just construction and sort of architecture related things. It's IT and it's healthcare and it's energy and all of those things. But here are some numbers just about what CTE looks like right now. So the last year that full data is available, which was the 2019 to 2020 school year, kind of ended with a funky school year, but more than 800,000 learners across the country participated in construction and architecture CTE programs. So most of those 600,000 students were high school students, and then 200,000 were post-secondary, which is mostly community college, a little bit of college engagement. But just understanding, that there are many hundreds of thousands of students coming out every year who are getting instruction in related things in construction and architecture and energy, and who have an interest in pursuing that, whether they're going on to community college, or some of them may not be. So again, the idea that this is a potential pool with which WAP agencies can engage to grow that pipeline. So here are a couple of examples. Green Generation Workforce Development Initiative in Chicago it's a formal partnership between a high school and then training providers in the weatherization or local weatherization network. So they're working with their local high school. It's a summer program, and then they meet twice a month during the academic year. Participants are earning BPI certifications during that year. So when they finish their, when they graduate at the end of their senior year, they have skills, they have certifications, and they're interested in this field. Other examples, again, there are a number of them that are not WAP specific, but there's a Bright Solar Futures Academy in Pennsylvania, and they sort of have a similar model, but they do their trip, lab-based training. They also do field trips. They do paid internships. They have industry credentials, and they're doing things related to solar PV, but also just electricity foundations, energy conservation, and general construction. And so if you're interested in finding out what CTE high school programs or community college programs may exist in your area, unfortunately, there's not like a super easy list or map where you can type in your zip code and get this thing. But if you go to the link I have here, you can find your state director, CTE director, and you contact them and they will say, here are because programs fall under these specific headings of construction and architecture and energy, things like that. So you can ask what are related programs that already exist in your area and connect to them. So here on this slide, I've included different ways that you can connect. So of course, there are internships and apprenticeships that are very formal ways of engaging, offering a senior in high school who's in a construction course a paid internship. And those are really wonderful ways to get to know potential people you may want to hire and build some of their skill sets. But there are even other things like, coming into a classroom and just being a guest speaker and talking about what weatherization is and, what the employment opportunities are and how you work with your community, those sorts of things. Job shadowing or site visits where you invite students to just come and see what it looks like in the real world, offering mentorship, things like that. Again, when we talk about increasing the size of that pie or building your pipeline, this is what does it, right? This is what is trying to get new students interested who didn't even know that weatherization existed, to understand that this is a thing, right? And so I just think, it's an opportunity. And I mentioned that NREL is working with DOE right now on creating a workforce development toolkit, and part of what we're going to include in that in every section, because we're going to follow a similar format to what you're seeing here in terms of recruitment and retention, but we're going to get feedback specifically from Department of Energy about how T&TA funds can be used or can't be used for each of these things, because I know that, I'd love to go guest speak at my local high school and I have no time, or I have no resources, or how do I charge it, whatever that looks like. So we're trying to make sure we have very explicit guidance on how you can use T&TA funds to cover some of these things.
And Allison, we had a comment here about some of the restrictions in WAP around wage growth, and the fact that like the cost per unit for the homes kind of limits wage growth. So one of the things that I wanted to say is that, with these programs, they're often done in partnership, right? And so they provide an opportunity to use Allison's metaphor, kind of expand the pie with respect to funding as well, right? So we know that there are certain funding restrictions or, like limits on how much the cost per unit for the homes can be, and therefore, the labor components associated with that. But these programs, while they take work to implement, they do provide an opportunity to build more partnerships and access different types of funding. And so it allows you to kind of diversify a little bit and make it a little easier to pay staff that way. So I wanted to mention that that part as well.
Yeah, and to give some examples, if you develop a registered apprenticeship program and bring on an apprentice, right, you are paying their wage, and there's a contract where you're agreeing to how much they're paying and what their wage growth potential is. If you're, for example, working the AmeriCorps program I talked about in Minnesota, the Climate Impact Corps, those agencies, because of how everything is structured, those agencies that are getting AmeriCorps members for an 11-month, it's not quite 12 months, but 11-month term, we're paying nothing, right? So they are getting they got several full-time staff people who are getting some education, who had an interest in learning these things, and provided support at no cost to them. So this is where, again, and so this is about building your pipeline. It's also just ways of supplementing your staff that are not just not as costly necessarily, right? So tagging onto what Juliana was saying. Okay, so this last little section that I'm going to talk about before I hand it over to Juliana is contractors as part of your workforce. So as much as 80% of WAP agencies use subcontractors for some or all of the work that they do in the field. Contractors can be great because they add flexibility, right? They can complement your staff with skills that you don't have, or you don't have the ability to invest in at this time, or that you don't need very often. They can supplement your staff if you have a crazy busy time period in your production schedule. But I also think it's important to remember that these contractors are facing all of the same workforce and hiring challenges that everyone here is facing. And so as WAP agencies, the more that you can do to support your subcontractors makes those, see them as part of your staff almost, can make those relationships better and make them just a better way to support what your agency is doing. So here are some general tips for success, in terms of technical requirements and procurement, the subgrantee trainings that I've mentioned a few times that are online have a procurement pathway. So you can learn again about exactly what those DOE requirements are around that. When you're bringing contractors on, set clear expectations. You can do this from the time you're doing your RFP to your contracting, and then making sure you're having regular check-ins. And then extending any of the training resources that you might offer to your staff to your contractors and their staff as well, both technical and soft skills, I think is really helpful, as well as sort of like, this is how WAP works, because it can be different than it is in the for-profit world. And then just really building relationships and respect. The example I gave when we did this workshop back in May was that when I worked at Habitat, when I was there, which started 15 or 16 years ago, they had the same plumber for 10 years, and he's still there when I go out. He's a bit salty. He's wonderful though. But like, same plumber subcontractor that they've used forever, right? And part of it is that he built relationships with those staff. The fact that I haven't worked with him in 8 years or something, and I go out there and he recognizes me and I recognize him, and we can catch up, right? He felt like he was part of the staff. If he had questions or concerns, he could go to them for resources, whatever that was. But I think it's really important to improving your retention with your contractors and making them a more valuable part of your team. I will also say the next couple slides on contractors, this is an area that there isn't a lot of information and resources that exist in the WAP world besides sort of that very dry procurement requirements. So I'm going to share some information here that came from an attendee at our May workshop who talked about the process that he goes through when trying to decide if contractors are the better use of his time versus, upping staff capability and that sort of thing. But I will just say, like, after this, if people have feedback on what would actually be useful to improve your process of working with contractors, that would be great, because we don't have a ton of information and resources here. So again, this is an example from a local weatherization agency in Colorado. His process for thinking through sort of the managerial side of things. So, first step is understanding the bottlenecks or constraints in your workflow processes. But I think really it's looking at staffing, right? Like, what is your staff capacity? Are they accumulating a lot of overtime, a lot of absenteeism? What is their expertise? What does your staff have now? What skills do they want to develop, right? Maybe there's something that you're subbing out and you have a longtime staffer that wants to gain that new skill, and that's an opportunity to invest in them versus hiring a contractor that you need only a handful of times a year, whatever that looks like. But really talking with your staff and analyzing that. And then, of course, understanding what does your workflow look like coming up. It's going to be a big part of that. What are the projects? Do you have the FTEs that you need to increase the production at whatever rate you have? And then just analyzing the gaps, looking at what you have and what you want to do and your resources, and coming up with those. And then you need to follow your procurement guidelines, right? And then evaluation, it comes back to that. So if you've brought on a contractor, you want to be checking in with them regularly, but also look back if you hired them because there were bottlenecks in your schedule and you still have bottlenecks in your schedule, even working with them, figure out, again, maybe the subcontractor is not the right answer or solution to your process, or maybe things need to be adjusted with them. You need to improve communication, whatever that looks like. But I do think it ties, Julie, I'm going to hand this over in just a second to Juliana to talk about staff retention, but a lot of subcontractors obviously can help with production, but I think it also has to do with your existing staff morale, right? You want to support your staff. You don't want to be requiring overtime or have all of those things, if you don't have to. And so understanding how subs can help you meet your production needs, but also keep your staff safe and happy and healthy are just really important things to think about. And as I mentioned, there's just not a lot of information out there specific to the WAP network about working with contractors. So I'd love to hear any feedback or any questions or comments about either things that you're doing or resources that might make this process easier for you. Juliana, is there anything in the chat?
Just to note that Amy also is looking for ways to promote what agencies are doing with blending the use of crews and contractors. So definitely reach out about your experience, even if you don't feel like it's particularly exciting. Just learning and hearing about what it feels like, what it looks like on the ground is useful, because they're like Allison said, we're still trying to collect more information in this space.
Yeah, and the idea of this workforce development toolkit we're putting together is, I mean, it's for everyone, but if you have a new staff coming on, or you're an agency that is has been entirely crew-based and you're looking to transition, right? And you might not know where, for a lot of people, you've been working with subs forever, and you don't even think of it as like as a formal process, or it may seem all very intuitive. But for people, and we've spoken with some of these people, for people who have not done it before, it can feel, it's new. And so, like I said, if there's anyone willing to or interested in sort of talking about those processes, or if you have ideas of resources DOE or others could provide to help that, we'd love to hear from you.
Great. And then we did also get a comment from Susan Linsome about the NASCASP wage survey and the living wages. And I did just want to note that the living wage data came from MIT and is based on county-specific factors. And so there's a living wage calculator that also lives on that on NASCASP's website that will compare the wage data from the respondents to the wage survey with the living wage data in that community, and it'll show that the living wage data for a single family household and multi-person households as well.
Perfect. Okay, well, I think I'll hand it over to you, Juliana.
Great. All right. So what Allison covered right now is kind of some of the initial recruitment, that early stage, how do you get people in the door efforts. But then once you have people in the door, it's so important to keep them. Allison, if you could go to the next slide. Again, taking this big picture, looking at the national workforce, COVID certainly is a factor, but there are also other life factors. But at least about 50% of staff were not confident that they were going to stay in their job based on recent survey work. And the people who are most likely to look at leaving are the ones that had the least amount of experience. Maybe they're newer at that workplace or newer in their careers, and so may not be as set or as established or confident in their job or their current job. And the same survey kind of found that while wages are really important for getting people hired and recruiting them to positions, it's not actually the only factor in, certainly not the only factor when people are considering about whether or not to stay. And they did find that opportunities for career advancement, professional development, training are often reasons that people cite as wanting to stay, or the lack of those wanting to leave. And so one of the themes that you'll see from these slides coming up for me is that while compensation is important, and it is, it's really not the only factor here. And so if you're able to address some of the other factors, you may find some flexibility around compensation. And so so that's part of what we're hoping to highlight here. If you could go to the next slide. Yeah, so kind of going back to that wage survey that Susan referenced and that I put a link to earlier. Basically, NASCASP conducted this wage survey and NREL did some additional analysis. And generally what we found is that employees are generally paid enough, paid living wages above poverty line, but that's often for single person households. And we know that there are often folks who are, supporting other family members. And so that is certainly a challenge. And then, where there's issues with critical turnover, constant or, frequent turnover, oftentimes those agencies paid lower wages for most positions. And this is where, looking at figuring out how can the funding sources be diversified so that wages can be augmented, I think is really like one of those big takeaways. seeking out additional sources of funding, partnerships, programs does take work, but in the long run, it can also help retain the qualified staff that you have and help them stay engaged and happy in the work that they're doing. And in general, one of the things that they also found was that crew-based subgrantees generally took less time to fill positions compared to contractor-based subgrantees. And so, we're not entirely sure as the reasons for that. It could be company culture, working at an agency versus a contractor may have some additional, non-financial benefits for that mission that Amy and other folks read out at the beginning. Let's go to the next slide. And, I think this is, most folks know this, but replacing workers does have costs in terms of the cost to hire and train someone new, the time lost in that replacement, work quality, and then also in just kind of workplace culture. And I do want to point out that generally folks have found that the average cost of turnover is, ranges like 90 to 200% of an existing worker's salary. So really, like, you want to hold on to the people that you've got. That will be one of the most cost-effective ways to meet your mission and keep your work going. So next slide. There's a range of factors, and I kind of alluded to them earlier, right, that influence employee retention. Obviously wages, but also fringe benefits and paid time off, flexibility in the schedule. And I think especially in the last couple of years, folks have come to expect a little bit more flexibility in their timing, but there also may be opportunities for flexibility in compensation, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. One of the things that's also really important is clear expectations and pathways for advancement or pathways for development. One of the things that the registered apprenticeship programs do really well is they provide clear pathways of moving up from achieving this skill and moving up and having those benchmarks that people know they can expect to advance. So even if they start at a certain level, knowing if they put in this amount of work, learn these skills, get this experience, then they have areas to advance. That is really critical. When folks don't see that pathway for advancement, they can often feel stuck and frustrated in the difficult parts of their job and not be able to see past that for a pathway for how to stay. And then, of course, company culture and having a safe, supportive, inclusive environment is really, really important, especially as we're looking at, well, I'm just going to say it's really important and not qualified at all. And then one of the things that I think also is a massive tool in our toolbox is tracking your turnover by exit interviews, understanding why people are leaving, right? If you can understand, the factors that are going into the reasons why they're leaving, whether it's, culture or management oriented, or it's the nature of the job, it's compensation, it's, personal things that are not related to the job, right? That gives you a ton of information for figuring out how to replace that person or what you might do in your organization to minimize that impact later on for your other employees. And this is an area where I think we have some resources later on conducting exit interviews, and they're not necessarily WAP specific, but again, one of the themes you'll get from today is that there's a lot of resources from other adjacent industries that we can draw on. Next slide. So the first part here, this kind of bridges the gap between the recruitment and the retention, is around effective job descriptions, and it's so there's a lot of text here. I'm not going to read through all of it. And these were kind of tips drawn from other industry publications and also from our workshop participants, that it's really important to communicate well the expectations of the positions, the roles, but also to avoid a lot of jargon or gendered language. Make sure that the job descriptions are inclusive. And one of the things that you can do to look at your current job descriptions is have your current staff or some of your peers take a look at your job descriptions and think, if I'm reading this, or maybe even family members, right, who may not be involved in weatherization, right? If I read this, do I understand what you're talking about? And does this sound appealing? It's, you know, writing good job descriptions a lot of times is just figuring out, like, what is the language that resonates with folks? And again, making sure that there's clear description of opportunity and the full range of benefits that the position provides, including professional development. Let's go to the next one. Okay, so mentoring. There's a lot of attention on mentoring right now within WAP. Some of that is specific and related to, you know, QCI mentoring, but we are still in the middle of a generational shift, as we have a lot of folks who've been in the program, you know, from the early days are looking at retirement, and we have a lot of new workers who are trying to get up to speed, and we're trying to fill in more positions, right? And so looking at mentorship as a way to help develop skills, identify, you know, challenges early on, and also, you know, mentorship provides some of that like institutional knowledge transfer that is really important. And mentorship can take a lot of different ways. There's you can set up formal mentorship between individual staff or staff and contractors in your organization, but it can also be informal in terms of making sure that as an organization culture, you're looking at bringing in your newer employees and making sure that there's opportunities for them to have low stakes, unstructured ways of interacting with their colleagues. So you can look at a range of ways to structure it. Oftentimes, though, it is important to provide a little bit of training for mentors on you know, how to engage with their mentees, but it doesn't have to be a big lift, and it can have really, really strong impacts. You know, it's kind of that, and a lot of people I think are interested in that like pay it forward, right? We've all had folks who we look to as mentors in our careers, and you know, think about how you can do that for next folks and structure that into your organization. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but there are resources for doing that at the link at the bottom. If we could go to the next slide. So this next one, succession planning. This is really important. We know that we have turnover, regardless of, you know, the efforts internally to retain people. Some folks retire, some people leave for personal reasons, some people leave because they're unsatisfied, or, you know, or a host of other reasons. Turnover will happen. And so it's important to make sure that you have the structures and systems in place so that the departure of any one person is not a critical loss for your organization. And so some of this is documentation, some of this is, you know, around job shadowing or developing skills. You may not necessarily have a full picture of all the skills that are needed for each job. And so you know, a good thing to do before someone is looking at leaving is just periodically, this might be every couple of years, have them identify those skills and competencies that they use in their day-to-day job. So that you can begin to think through, okay, do we have people who could step into that? And then it's important also just to talk with staff about, you know, what do they envision in their career in terms of like progressing. You know, some folks after a lot of time may look for, may be interested in staying in the organization, but shifting roles, or, you know, taking on more senior leadership in a similar role. And so understanding, you know, not assuming that there's a single set pathway for folks to develop within an organization is really, really important. So again, we have some resources here around succession planning, and it's like most like medical visits. It's best to do before there's a problem. Like engage in your succession planning before you know someone's going to leave. And this can be, you know, this is also an area where like if you're in an organization that runs multiple programs, this can be, you can get support from like your HR or from your senior leadership in this, so it doesn't have to come just from WAP as well. Let's go to the next slide. So I am not going to do diversity, equity, and inclusion justice in the time that we have here. Like, there's so much more content here than we could possibly cover. There's way more than we could cover in the continuous improvement workshop here. But as Allison mentioned at the beginning, you know, the workforce within the energy efficiency and construction sectors doesn't right now reflect the makeup of the workforce. And so it is important, as we're looking at bringing on new workers, to understand, like, what are some of those systemic barriers, and what are the cultural barriers, what are just, like, you know, process barriers that might prevent people from considering our work, or might prevent people from feeling comfortable and having you know, feeling like they identify with working at our organizations. So I think the important thing here is that it's not, we want to focus on not just bringing in diverse people, but understanding what people need to account for their different perspectives and backgrounds. And we do have in here, again, like a bunch of resources for how to do assessments of your organization, how to start thinking about applying diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if we go to the next slide, you know, it is really important because it does, you know, having an equitable and inclusive workplace improves the quality of the work, improves the experience of clients, it improves the company culture, and generally just is beneficial to the work that we're doing. And so the key thing is to have an actual, like, official diversity, equity, inclusion action plan built with input from your organization and stakeholders. And in a lot of, like, organizational culture or systems spaces, you know, it's important to look at have a way to, like, track how you're doing from year to year, from time to time. And so this may involve, you know, developing qualitative ways of gathering information from your employees, from your stakeholders, and see how you're doing. You know, because I'm sure most folks have heard the adage, if it's not measured, it doesn't improve. And that's really true here. And figuring out how to track this, right? It is qualitative, but there's assessments out there. There's ways to figure out, you know, if what you're tracking over time is changing, getting better, getting worse, that can be really helpful. And then the other thing that I wanted to note here is that as the under the Justice 40 initiative from the federal government, DOE in particular is interested in figuring out, you know, understanding how WAP as a program, among many programs that are considered for this, you know, how WAP is addressing the needs of disadvantaged communities, and so as a department, there's going to be more attention and more resources put into this space. So I want you all to know that even though I touched on it briefly for like 4 or 5 minutes here, there's a wealth of resources out there, and there will be more attention given to this and how to implement it in your agencies. So it's kind of like a stay tuned for more, and here's some resources to get you started. All right, I want to go to I want to pause right there actually, and see Allison or Amy if there's any questions that have come up, or if folks, you know, have questions right now.
There's nothing in the chat that's come up.
I did remember what I wanted to mention, right? In the workshop, we had a bit of a discussion. If you can go back a slide, that'd be great. But if not, that's also fine. on, DEI efforts always seem to take the back seat, right? There's always something that's more urgent around production, around retention, around hiring. And this is why, we're really focusing on having an action plan, because it can be easy to continue on the way that you've been operating, but that doesn't mean that that's the best way to do it. And continuing as we've been operating may lead to continued difficulty with recruitment or with retention, with satisfaction, with provision of services. And so there was this general feeling among the participants that it's really important that this be front and center and not an afterthought in our production, right? And so it takes leadership, it takes dedicated attention to looking at organizational practices, how production works, how client interaction, internal processes. It takes a lot of dedication, but is something that folks in the workshop and me personally, I genuinely believe that this is going to be critical to the success of the Weatherization Assistance Program going forward. And so, the other thing I think it's important to note is that diversity will look different in different places. When most people hear diversity, they often think of racial or ethnic diversity, but that's not the only kind of diversity. There's diversity in, educational background, ranges of experience, age for sure, gender, lots of different factors here. And so, even if you're in a location that maybe looks fairly homogeneous, there's still diversity that needs to be tended to. And you need to understand, what is it that you can do to make a workplace that people want to be a part of. So I wanted to touch on that before we go forward. But yeah, this intentional nurturing of diversity, equity, inclusion, it won't happen unless it's intentional, and it does take work, but can pay a lot. Really is critical to success. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide, the last few slides that we have are just some examples from some of the workshop participants around what they're doing to improve with retention. So this first one here comes from Energy Resources Center in Colorado, and they're they gave some great ideas on onboarding for how to, once you get someone hired, how do you help them feel a big part of the organization, get them ready and set up for success. So they do full tours that are focused on new employees and introduce them to all staff on their first day. They do talk through the organization and career pathways and have a handbook. This figure on the side is one of their flyers that does talk through some of that career pathway information so that people understand where they can progress. They provide branded swag, and it's such a little thing, but there's a lot of people for whom that does make a difference in feeling like you're a part of the organization. You are wearing it. It is on you, right? You can see that and be proud. And then they also have kind of a key point of contact for new employees. And this is not, my understanding is that this is not typically a manager. This is not someone who is teaching them or training. It's just a point of contact, someone that they can have that kind of unstructured peer support for, or ask the stupid question that you don't want to ask because you're new. And so they really look for to try to make those first few weeks set the tone of getting support, of making it a space where new employees can ask questions and are supported in that. Let's go to the next slide. As far as retention, this is just kind of some of their examples, right? They do try to have a fun atmosphere in their warehouse. They didn't have a lot of detail on how they tend to their culture, but they really do focus on trying to make sure everyone is included. And part of that is through their regular meetings, making sure that there are opportunities to open up, that it's not just top-down speaking at people. They provide volunteer opportunities, actually. I think there can sometimes be this belief that people give so much to their job that they don't have anything left. But the volunteer opportunities do provide for an option for deeper engagement, for socializing, for giving back, and can really help people feel connected. And then just like they're looking at professional work and workforce development opportunities for advancement. So yeah, this was some of the examples from ERC. If we go to the next slide, again, another agency, Northwest Colorado Council of Governments, and I swear we weren't just picking Colorado organizations; these are just the ones who wanted to share in our workshop. Some of the things that they're doing to tend to their culture, right, are safe space meetings, making sure that people have the opportunity to ask the questions and voice the concerns and actively ask for that employee input and buy-in. They do actually practice listening, and they spend time practicing listening, which I think is something that like seems so basic and assumed, but really demonstrates that intention really well. And then they also have an employee profit sharing model. And I don't know a whole lot of the details around this, but what it does, right, is that it does help the employees feel invested in the success and be invested in the success of their organization, which not all organizations can set that up that model, but if your organization does have the option for that, it may be worth looking at for deepening that commitment and tenure. And the other thing that they're, I mentioned earlier, right, they're looking at diversifying their funding to augment wages. So pulling in utility funding, state funding, and some fee-for-service funding to help cover additional portions of staff salaries so that the WAP portion will still stay within the average cost per unit limit, but they're able to pay the staff a little bit more and boost the wages to a point where people are wanting to stay. Another example that I forgot to mention earlier is looking at kind of that flexibility between wages and time off or other benefits. Allison and I were talking a couple days ago about an organization, not in WAP, but still in kind of the construction area, where they were looking at proposing multiple job packages, one that has, maybe a slightly higher pay or standard pay and less benefits, and then another that offered more on the benefits side at a slightly lower pay. And so thinking through how can that flexibility, what is it that your staff need or want, can be a really important way of thinking through some of those like non-monetary ways of retaining folks. Like personally, I decided last year to drop down to working 80% time so that I could have the additional time off to tend to, the personal side of my life, right? So I was able to make that choice. I don't, want to suggest that people make, such a drastic move everywhere or like offer that as a blanket, but like I think it's an important way to think through like what are the trade-offs that your staff want, right? Is it more time off to be able to tend to their lives? Is it maybe around flexibility of their work hours so that they can, take their kids to school or other programs? What would actually be helpful in keeping people happy at their jobs? And you won't learn that unless you ask. And again, it's better to ask before it's a problem. So if you are looking at retention and what some of your practices are and you're limited in funding, it may be worth looking at that flexibility between benefits and compensation. So I've seen, Allison, that there's been some activity in the chat. Can I ask you to help out?
Yeah, there was a question about the relationship between Head Start, and I don't know if Amy wants to talk with that between wages in WAP and Head Start, since they are often under the CAP heading. Do you have anything that you want to talk about there, Amy, or just that that was a point of conversation?
Can you repeat the question? I had to step away for a second.
Oh, sure. It looks like you were having some back and forth with,
About the wages.
yeah. So I don't know if you have any background you want to provide on that. It wasn't specific to what Juliana was discussing, but.
But it's an issue that we're very interested in. Like, we know that it's a constant struggle for different agencies in different parts of the country, depending on what the situation is in their relationship with their state and what's going on inside the community action agency. Like I said, one recurring theme that I have heard is that there are constraints in the Head Start program. So many of our community action agencies run Head Start, and there are severe wage constraints with the Head Start teachers. And so whether it's through feedback from their board or through just considering the optics of the political environment, there's a consideration around not wanting to pay the weatherization workers more than they pay their Head Start teachers. So that's an issue that I'm kind of interested in learning more about. And when I raised my hand earlier, I just wanted to, in general, reiterate the fact that for everyone on the call today, we at NCAP and myself personally are very interested in hearing from you. So if you have thoughts on any of this, please send me an email, because I like to always remind everybody we don't know what we don't know. So the only way that we know things is if you tell us. So there is a lack of national, like there isn't a national database of the weatherization experience on the ground. And so you have to tell us what's going on. And overall, this workforce development is a developing issue. So it's an ongoing dialogue. The dialogue will continue. So I posted a bunch of things in the chat, which I'll reiterate in the follow-up email that goes out to everybody. Just links to sessions that we've had in the past that touched on workforce development issues, and then sessions that we have in the future that could also focus on workforce development. And the one issue that does come up is it is tied to braiding, because the biggest wage constraints come with the DOE funds. And I know that there are policy considerations around, when and how can we make it easier to spend the DOE funds, but there are also opportunities available to braid outside dollars in different, use different methods to braid that can actually free up pathways to paying higher wages. So I'm not doing it justice because I'm not a weatherization technical expert, but we have an upcoming webinar with Derek Schroeder from DOE that will talk about the mechanics of when and how to do that. And we also had a webinar last fall with a weatherization director from New Hampshire who talked about his strategies for increasing pay. So he was using his LIHEAP dollars and his utility dollars and managing the workflow through his payroll system so that he was able to offer, like $40,000 and $45,000 annual starting salaries, which is significantly higher than the average in the NASCAP wage survey. So we're interested in this topic.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Amy. I think that really that provides a nice lead in, Allison. I think if you can just go to the next slide, which is just kind of a landing page for discussion, right? We want to open this up as an opportunity to hear from you. What are you doing, or what are the challenges that you're facing? What resources would be helpful? And before we do that, I did just want to note that it looks like next year we will also be developing a series of trainings around braiding funding to support the need for a growing workforce. So you can expect to see additional resources. As Allison mentioned, we're also pulling together a lot of the information from this session into a workforce development toolkit. So that should be out shortly. There's a lot going on here. And so I'm going to stop talking, and we'd love to hear from you all. Amy, I'm not sure how you like to manage folks coming off of mute, so maybe I'll hand it over to you. But what are you doing and what do you need?
If you would, I think historically what we have done is stopped the screen share and then put the screen up with everybody's faces. And you are welcome to either post a question in the chat or use the raise hand function. Since the video is being recorded, I think there's more of an emphasis on verbal. So if you're comfortable speaking out loud, you don't have to come off camera. But yeah, because once it's on YouTube, the listening portion of it is attractive. So you're going to reach a wider audience. So I see Ben Dewicki.
Yeah, hey, y'all. Thank you. This is super, super informative. I am Detroit-based and I actually work for a utility energy efficiency program developer and implementation contractor, but we interface a lot with the local Weatherization Assistance Program, constantly talking with the local subgrantee and having these conversations. One of the things that we're working on is, so our utility energy efficiency program is just like many programs around the country, where it's the main program is a direct install program. So we've got a whole staff full of people who have been out into homes doing direct installs, light bulbs, thermostats, pipe wrap, things like that. They're not technically trained in weatherization or energy auditing, but they are getting a good overview of energy. They're getting used to getting into people's homes. Their core values fits for our organization. And what we're seeing is those folks, after a couple of years, they want to upskill. And so it's created this really natural conduit that I think can be replicated really around the country, where, these utility programs, especially these sort of low-hanging fruit type direct install programs exist. And so to create that pipeline, I actually don't think is necessarily too hard of a thing, and could really help be a recruiting tool for upskilling and giving folks upward mobility in their career paths.
Thanks, Ben. And the other thing I want to build into that is that we know that people want to upskill, and we're going to keep needing to recruit people in those early level positions. And as long as we're planning for that, right, and building that pipeline, then it's not necessarily as much of a problem. I think Allison touched on this a little bit with the AmeriCorps or the other core programs, right? Even if you know that person's going to be temporary or entry level, if you plan for that, there will be a certain percentage who stay. And it's important to just recognize some people will leave, and that the investment will likely stay within the industry, even if it's not with your organization. Do we have other folks who want to share what they're doing or what would be helpful for you? What resources we could, produce, or guidance from DOE?
There was a comment earlier about an interest in the fee-for-service model from someone from Michigan. I don't know if you, Hurley, wanted to talk any more about it, but we can also just acknowledge that and speak to it a bit.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Okay.
Yep.
I'm just asking a question in regards to how do you leverage more funds? When you brought up the point of trying to improve weatherization programs throughout and keeping employees and finding ways to leverage funds and increase the employability for the agencies. We want to increase our salaries or our wages, but also we're limited on what we can do in regards to the amounts that we have allocated for our budgets. So my question would be, what new programs are out, or maybe they're already in play? What programs are out that we can look into for pay for service? Maybe it could be utility companies giving kickbacks for energy savings, or are there other programs that can help to offset costs so that we can leverage our funds as most effectively as we possibly can? And that was something I just wanted to get some information on if anybody has it.
Amy, we'll turn that to you, I think.
Sure. I mean, it depends on where you are, but the main vehicle for additional funds, as far as I'm concerned, is your Public Utility Commission and the work that they do forcing utility companies to spend money on stuff. So when the utility companies have to offer, sometimes they're not being forced to, sometimes they do it voluntarily, but there is a big uptick in funding availability because across the country, all the states are passing different laws and initiating different proceedings to increase utility spending on energy efficiency programs. And in that negotiation process, they will talk about how the administrators will be compensated. And so and I have a background in this process in Illinois, so it can get a little bit slippery, right? Depends on who's involved in the stakeholder process, how those negotiations go down, because some of the advocates are going to think we need to minimize the impact, like how are these ratepayer dollars spent? But there is a movement to make sure that community action agencies and weatherization providers are appropriately compensated for the work that they're doing. So in some cases, you could have a conversation where the parties at that table are talking about piggybacking on the existing infrastructure of the weatherization, like the existing Weatherization Assistance Program implementation infrastructure. So they're thinking, well, they're already weatherizing all these houses. We'll just give them an extra $1 million and they can braid that in. And there's no administrative funding tied to the extra utility dollars. You can make sure to advocate for separate administrative funding from those utility revenue streams, because I'm here to tell you, the utilities have money.
Yeah, and
they can give you some of it.
I want to add on to that. I previously had a background in utility regulation. So from the other side of the table that Amy was sitting on, and public utilities commissions, need to make sure that utilities have rates that are basically fair, just, reasonable, and sufficient. And oftentimes, that like fair and just is looking at what are the differences between their customer classes. And oftentimes, energy efficiency reductions and low-income through low-income programs are some of the most affordable source of energy savings or like capacity that utilities can acquire. So even if I know that not all states have existing requirements specifically around energy efficiency targets, they still have within the regulatory space a requirement to make sure that they're serving their customers in a fair and just way. So there's a lot of resources that could be compiled. I think Amy, if you don't already have a whole bunch, we know where to find resources for helping to unlock some of the utility funding. And I do want to shout out to my former home state of Washington, which has a really good model for representing community action agencies in utility proceedings to make sure that that perspective is being represented and that adequate funding for those programs is provided.
Right, and I will add that's a service that's available to anyone in a community action agency or a weatherization subgrantee who is not a community action agency. They're welcome to reach out to me personally, because our Energy Partnerships project is funded by DOE to support leveraging on behalf of weatherization implementers. And so if you send me an email, think of me as your personal consultant, or you can think of me as a high-priced consultant or a personal assistant. Either way, I'm at your service. So depending on what state you're in, the first thing that we can do is just figure out, depending on the level of knowledge of the person who's asking us for help, we'll help you figure out who is your public utility commission, what is going on, what outside advocates are available, work with. So usually we would want to involve the state association if they're big enough and have the capacity. And then at the national level, we work closely with the National Consumer Law Center on a lot of utility things. So there's NCLC, there's NASUCA, the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates. I think it would be obnoxious if I plugged yet another previous webinar, but I will say that a couple of months ago, we had a webinar with Citizen Action of Indiana and the Indiana Community Action Association, and they went over the details of how they revamped through the Public Utility Commission process. They revamped the system that they were using to access utility funds, and everybody was happy. The utility participated in the webinar because the utility turned out to be happier in the end because they got more bang for their buck.
And I think that's also a really important example as a state where statewide energy efficiency programs had been defunded recently, and an example that I think if it can work there, like it can pretty much work anywhere. So I do want to highlight that Allison put into the chat a link to a form where, you know, if you didn't feel comfortable speaking up or you want some more time to think through what you might want to share about your workforce recruitment and retention efforts, we have this very short form where we would love to have you give us your input so we can start to capture and compile this, like, this view into, you know, what are you facing? Are you doing anything new or exciting, or just, you know, what are your challenges? So please, if you have the chance, fill out that form. And I think Amy is also going to put the link into the chat for the webinar with the that she was just mentioning. And then Amy, I'm wondering if for the follow-up email, we can just have a little bit of a digest of these links that were put into the chat.
Definitely, that's one of the things that we'll include. So that's one of the beautiful aspects of doing the follow-up email, because there's so many new things that come up as the conversation unfolds organically. So we can make sure that everybody gets everything that was mentioned.
So we do have 5 more minutes. I just wanted to see if there's anyone else who had questions or experiences they want to share, concerns in kind of the workforce recruitment and retention space. Okay.
It's been a 90-minute webinar and everyone's tired. I will say with that form, again, it's, you know, no need to talk right now. To build on what Juliana was saying about this form, it's an easy thing to fill out, but what we would, you know, we're creating a workforce development toolkit. We're going to put all of the links to all of the things that we've been talking about all in one place so that you don't have to remember it all or follow up with that email, and it will be constantly updated. It'll be on DOE's website. But case studies are really helpful, right? For, you know, we can say this is a great way to do XYZ, but if you can hear another agency say we did XYZ and it really was helpful, that's much more compelling and useful, right? Then someone can follow up and they can get more details, or they can understand what were your lessons learned, or the struggles, things you would do again, wouldn't do again, whatever. So really, you know, we have a few case studies from this workshop we did back in May, and we're going to incorporate them into this online toolkit. But anything that you can share, it can be big, it can be small, it can involve outside partners or not, but anything that you've found success in terms of bringing new staff in, or keeping your staff, keeping them happy, keeping them trained, and all of that, you know, put in a couple of sentences. We'll follow up with more information, but really, you know, we want this information, but really we want to be able to share it. There were, you know, 25 people who attended the May workshop. There are 100 people that attended today, but there are many more out there, and we want to make sure we're getting the word out to as many people as we can.
I have one final question I forgot to mention too. I am personally curious about the value of benefits to our prospective weatherization recruits, because we know that the wages are relatively low. And so with the advent of the Affordable Care Act, many states have increased their Medicaid threshold. And so it depends on the household circumstances, but I'm wondering, there's a conversation to be had around how much access to health insurance is an attractive benefit to a young person who's just starting out, especially if they already could have health insurance through Medicaid or expanded Medicaid or some kind of state health insurance program. Because I know in talking to our network, most of our community action agencies offer very robust benefits packages, and that is generally considered an attractive thing for most recruits. But in some cases, it turns out that things like flex time and paid leave are the attractive part, and not necessarily the health insurance, because of the economics of the wages and the access to other options for health insurance. So if anyone has thoughts on that or experiences on that, I'd love to hear about it. So.
I feel like I want to give space if someone else has thoughts, but Amy, I think I'm really glad you brought that up. That's something we can talk to NASCASP about, if there's room within the next iteration of the wage survey to disaggregate benefits at all. And then I would also say, sometimes the easiest thing is to ask existing employees what worked for them, you know, what brought them in, or what you would want to see more. So it's not necessarily the full scope of, what's appealing to the people you're trying to recruit, but at least understanding what has worked for the people that you've brought in.
Well, and our sub-grantees can tell us if their new hires are taking advantage of employee paid health insurance. So if it requires an out-of-pocket contribution and they're paying for it, then it has value to them. But if they're opting not to take it or something like that, that's a big indicator. I know with the Missouri folks that we've talked about a lot, they said that the biggest draw for their new crew recruits is the 4-day work week. So I can just reiterate that because of the geographic because of the geography of their service territory, it's a multi-county service territory with a lot of rural. And so in order to there's a lot of drive time. And so having 4 10-hour days works for them administratively. And it is also very attractive to career-oriented workers that want to have an extra day off.
Great. Well, we are right at time. Allison's laptop battery died, so at least we got through the vast majority of it. But yeah, we're very grateful for your time. We know this was a little bit of like drinking from a fire hose, so we're hoping that with the information we'll send out afterwards, you're able to digest it and think through how you might apply it to your organization. If they're in that form for like what you're doing, if there's questions that you're not sure how to do, or you want to see what are other people doing, feel free to add that in there as well. But I think we can wrap it up, and Amy, I'll just turn it to you for last words.
Great. I just want to thank everybody again for participating. We look forward to I recognize some of your faces and names, so I look forward to seeing some of you again in future sessions. And I'll just reiterate for the last time, don't hesitate to send me an email if you have a question or a comment. We'll go through the chat and make sure that the closeout email includes the links and information that was raised. So if there's something that you wanted to catch and you can't find it, don't worry, it will be included in the email. Thank you again. And thank you to our wonderful presenters. All of the national labs, I'm always super impressed with all of the work that you do.
Thank you all.